become an Egyptologist?
I think like many boys and girls of primary school age, I became fascinated by prehistoric man. I may have been interested in dinosaurs for a while, but I think it was very, very soon ancient Egypt for me. So I tried to read everything I could about that fascinating culture. I went to the youth library and went to the museum where I finally got my present job. So it started very early.
And what is your job at the National Museum of Antiquities?
At the Leiden Museum of Antiquities, I am curator of the Egyptian department, which is to say I am responsible for managing the collection, which is one of the 10 best collections in the world of ancient art of Egypt. And it means I have to tell people about what we have, give information to scholars and to the general public, organize exhibitions. I do research, I add objects to the collections, I publish them, etc.
How did you get the idea to make an exhibition on Egyptian magic?
In the course of the years, I came to the conclusion that magic was one of the basic elements of ancient Egyptian culture. It was at the root of the whole civilization, of the whole religion, of the daily life. Everything was centered about magic. Because the Egyptians had the feeling that human beings are something special in creation. They have a privileged position in creation. They are different from the animal world. Human beings have speech, have creative powers, have writing, and that is all to be considered as gifts from the gods to help human beings cope with their existence. And that's magic.
What was magic to the ancient Egyptians?
Magic can be described as everything you say and do in order to influence fate, to affect fate in a supernatural way. So magic really is something that can help you to cope with your daily existence. We, in our modern life, are used to social security, pensions, excellent health care. All of that didn't exist in antiquity. People were left to themselves and they felt utterly helpless. And magic helped them cope with the existence. If you knew the right tricks, the right words, if you could establish contacts with the gods by means of magic, you could ask them to help you, both here on earth and in the hereafter.
What kind of people were magicians in ancient Egypt?
So many people had some knowledge of magic themselves. Basic knowledge, household remedies, so to say. You could also go to a wise old man or woman in your village, a witch doctor, who could help you getting medicine, or you could learn certain magical spells from him, or he could help you in saying those magic words himself. On a higher level, there was organized magic in the temples, for instance. Priests were also trained as magicians. Scribes were trained as magicians, because if you could read and write, you belonged to the 1% of the population who had those supernatural powers. And so magic could be found with scribes, with priests. And then there were those super magicians who had done higher education in an academy of magic, which was called the House of Life. The House of Life was some kind of temple archive where priests collected the wisdom of the past centuries. And they wanted to find out, how does the universe operate? And how can we affect fate by knowing those physical rules of the universe, of the cosmos.
What kind of magic was used in daily life?
In daily life, people were struggling with their existence. They got strange diseases. They didn't know how to cure them. So if you went to a physician, the physician would investigate your body, he would come to a diagnosis, he would give you perhaps a remedy, but he would also pronounce magical spells. So it was a mixture of partly almost scientific principles and those supernatural aspects. People were also struggling with other problems, like, for instance, infertility. They couldn't get children, and having children was essential because the children will take care of their aging parents. There was no social welfare. So they went to the priests, to the magicians, to find ways out of that unwished situation. And then, of course, people had problems like, for instance, there was a lot of mortality among young children, but also among their mothers. It was very dangerous putting children in the world. So women and children needed special protection. And all that kinds of daily life aspects was closely connected with magic.
Was magic used in the temple cult?
At a higher level, the Egyptian society took care of the protection of the Egyptian population. So there were priests in the temple who were performing daily rituals to establish contacts with the gods, but also to ward off dangers. For instance, every day priests climbed to the roof of the temple at sunrise, and there they destroyed beeswax images of the enemy of the sun god, a snake who might devour the sun. In order to prevent that, they were destroying these wax images in a fire or by trampling them or by decapitating them. That kind of rituals we can't imagine, but the Egyptians thought if you do that on a daily basis, Egypt will be fine for another day. And the priests were also destroying images of Egypt's traditional enemies, the Asiatics, the Libyans, the Nubians from the south. And again, there were wax images or clay images, and they were decapitating them, burning them, spitting on them, piercing them. That kind of rituals kept Egypt safe and alive. And finally, there were annual festivals, you might say, where there were dramatic performances, rituals, plays, you might say, but it's not a play, it was very, very serious. During those performances, again, images of the traditional gods who were enemies of the benevolent gods were destroyed. And all of Egypt took part in those rituals.
Was magic needed for the afterlife?
The main problem was, of course, death. Everybody has to face death. Everybody will come to the netherworld, and you had better come well prepared. So the deceased was put in the burial chamber, surrounded by magical tools to help him in the hereafter. The burial chamber was, as it were, a magic box full of implements. And one of the main elements in the burial chamber was the Book of the Dead. The Book of the Dead, a long scroll of papyrus, specially written for the deceased, was at the same time a guidebook for the hereafter and that person's passport and credit card. So if you took that scroll with you, you would find your way in the netherworld. You had to go through the netherworld, cross many canals, for instance. You had to cross water. You would encounter dangerous animals and ferocious demons. And finally, you would come to the king of the hereafter, the god Osiris, who would then decide whether you were the right person to be admitted to the hereafter, to the netherworld, whether you could live there forever. But you would have to pass a test. Your heart would be weighed on the scales to find out whether it was heavy with sin or not. And everybody had to face that test. And the Book of the Dead helped you pronounce the right words during that verdict.
Did Egyptian magic survive in Roman and Islamic times?
It's remarkable that Egyptian magic survived even after the pharaonic civilization disappeared. Egypt was conquered first by the Greeks under Alexander the Great, then by the Romans. And the Egyptians were such an ancient people that for the Greeks and Romans they were incredibly old and wise. And their wisdom was partly supernatural wisdom. So the best scholars of the empire in the new capital of Alexandria, they came together and they started studying the Egyptian traditions and translating the Egyptian magical texts into Greek. And those were stored in the famous library of Alexandria, the Museum. It was full of scrolls on astronomy, medicine, geography, but part of that cosmic wisdom was colored by magic. And that was the fascination also of the Greeks and Romans. And in that milieu, they developed what is known as the Hermetic treatises, the treatises of the god Hermes, who is no other than the Egyptian god of magic, Thoth. So the books of the Egyptian god Thoth had a second life in Greco-Roman civilization.
Does Egyptian magic still have influence today?
At the end of classical antiquity, the books of Thoth, of Hermes, disappeared. Nobody knew about them. But then, in 1460, a monk from Florence came back from Greece. He had visited an ancient monastery, and in the library there he had found a copy in Greek of those Hermetic treatises. And he brought it to Florence. And the scholars at the court of the Medicis were fascinated by this glimpse of the ancient world of magic. And there was an upsurge of magical books and magical research, you might say, in the culture of Renaissance. It became a part of that culture, of Neoplatonism, of Christianity. It was all linked together. Hermes, the ancient god Thoth, was seen as the master of Moses. Moses, who himself was a magician, as the Bible tells us. So that kind of traditions then became part of, well, as I say, Christianity, but also of Freemasonry, of the Rosicrucians, of the Mormons. They all took over parts of that ancient cosmic wisdom, which they believed dated back right to the age of the pyramids. And as such, many people nowadays are still fascinated by that kind of esoteric religions, and you will always find there is an Egyptian element in what they believe, even nowadays.
Can you tell me about one of your favorite objects of the exhibition?
There are several objects in the exhibition which have a special attraction to me. For instance, there's a wonderful papyrus, a large scroll many meters long, which is known as the magical Demotic Papyrus. It dates to the Roman period, the 3rd century of our era. It was part of a library that was put in a safe place by a magician somewhere around Luxor in present-day Egypt. And it is the longest magic book from Egypt. It contains more than 90 different recipes, you might say. It's mainly about predicting the future. magicians believed they could do that. It's also about how to get the love of a woman, how to influence her. And there are also various magical tricks to get a better position in society. So ancient pharaonic principles of magic have been updated to serve in the Roman Empire, serve present-day needs of a Roman population in Egypt. And it's a wonderful mixture of everything.
And are there other objects you like very much?
There's another object which opens a whole new world of experience. That is what we call a corn mummy. It is an image in the shape of a mummy with a mask made of beeswax. When you would open the mummy, you would find out it consists of mud and grains of barley. And the barley has been sprinkled with water and started to become small green plants. That's the symbolism of new life created from dead material. It is not only a symbol, it's a magical means to recreate vegetation, to recreate life itself. This kind of images of mummies with barley were made during annual festivals all over Egypt, and that coincided with the start of the new agricultural season. So in late summer, when the Nile inundation receded from the fields and the farmers were ready to resume their work, the priests would make these images to ensure the fertility of the fields. Egypt is full of these images. Often people haven't understood what they are, but modern research has shown what they contain, and there are also magical texts on the walls of certain temples which explain about this annual procedure.
Is there another object you really like?
A fascinating object in the exhibition is a number of linen bands. They don't look very important. There are images of Egyptian gods drawn on these bands, 12 gods, and you can already guess 12 must be related with the 12 months of the year, some kind of calendar. Now we know that there was a ritual at the end of the calendar. The calendar in Egypt consisted of 12 months of 30 days, and then there were 5 extra days, like our leap day, added to the calendar. And that was a very dangerous period. That's what the Egyptians thought, because what would happen if the time came to a standstill? This was outside the ordinary calendar. Anything might happen. So you needed special magical care to ensure that life would go on, that time would restart, would be reset. There were spells for that, and the spells say people have to be specially protected during these 5 days, because anything may happen. All kinds of demons come and put people in danger. What should you do? Take a band of linen, draw the 12 gods of the months on it, and fix it around your throat. We have a papyrus with this text in the museum. There are 12 little drawings of the gods you should draw on the linen band. Nobody realized that in our collection in Leiden we have those bands. They actually exist. And a couple of years ago I discovered that, and I discovered that the bands and the papyrus really are closely connected, and that this ritual was actually enacted.
And is there a last object you really like in the exhibition?
There's a wonderful statue from the Louvre, which is one of the largest healing statues of ancient Egypt. I should explain, of course. In daily life, people had trouble with all kinds of animals that came to their houses. I'm referring to snakes and scorpions especially. If you were bitten or stung, it would be very painful, but you could also die, of course, because of the poison. People went to witch doctors, sought protection, and they came home then with a small figure, usually, of a god which would protect you against snakes and scorpions. But there were also large sculptures. Usually they depict the witch doctors themselves, the specialists who could take care of your trouble with snakes and scorpions. And these healing statues were put up in the forecourts of temples, and any patients could go there, could touch the statue, or they could pour water over it, and the statue is completely covered with magical designs and magical texts. And the water would take the power of those images and texts, and then you could drink it or you could put it on your wounds. And it's a fascinating figure. It's a beautiful work of art as well, from the Louvre, and a special thing in this exhibition.
Could you tell me about one last favorite object in the exhibition?
From ancient Egypt, we have about 15 letters to the dead. Letters written by a living person to a dead person. And the Egyptians thought that that was possible, that the dead could really receive such a letter, read it, and act according to what was written there. You could write such a letter, for instance, on a drinking bowl. You put water in it, put it next to the tomb, the dead spirit would come out, drink from the water, and see, oh, I got mail. We have a wonderful letter to the dead written on papyrus in the Leiden Museum, and it's now in the exhibition. It's written by a widower to his deceased wife, Iri, and he starts just addressing her in a rather polite way, but he becomes rather aggressive in the end. And if you read between the lines, you realize that this widower was having nightmares. The spirit of his wife would come to him, and she would have problems with him because she was accusing him of going to other women. And maybe he already did it during their marriage. And anyhow, the widower says, I did never anything of that kind. I took care of you my whole life. I was an excellent husband, and you should stop this nonsense, or I will put you to court. So even that could be done with the spirit of a deceased person. It's a fascinating letter.
Can you tell us the reason why you can't be here in Quebec at the opening of the exhibition?
Unfortunately, I can't attend the opening of the Magic exhibition in Quebec because I will be in Egypt, where we have a research project in Saqqara, close to Cairo, where we have been excavating these 40 years in one of the cemeteries of the ancient Egyptian capital, Memphis. It's a wonderful research project, and of course I have to be there as field director.
And why is the National Museum of Antiquities excavating in Egypt?
This special project in Saqqara is very important for the Leiden Museum because a large part of the Leiden collection came from that cemetery. The cemetery was discovered early in the 19th century by tomb robbers who took the best pieces, the statues, the inscriptions, the wall reliefs. And they sold it all over the world, and a large part of what they found came to Leiden. And now, almost 200 years later, we are back in the same area, which was completely covered by desert sand again. Nobody knew what was there, but we had certain hints that we could expect beautiful monuments there. And we found them. We found the tombs of the highest officials of the Egyptian Empire from the time of Tutankhamun, Akhenaton, Ramses II, and other famous pharaohs. And it's from these tombs that we have parts already in the Leiden Museum, and we are now finding the archaeological context of those splendid treasures of the Leiden Museum. It's a wonderful project.
And what are the plans for this year's excavation?
The coming season, 2015, which will take place in May of this year, we will investigate a tomb that we found already 2 years ago. At the time, there was no time to finish the whole tomb. We only excavated the chapel that was erected above ground on the desert surface, a chapel where a family of the deceased could put down food and drink for the dead relatives. What we haven't seen yet is the actual burial chambers underground. So we have to go down through a hole in the floor. There's a vertical shaft leading to the burial chambers, which were cut out in the underlying rock. And we hope to find a hint there of who built this tomb, because so far we have no inscriptions, hardly any wall reliefs, and it's still a large mystery, which we hope to solve.
And what was your favorite find of the past excavations?
During the past 40 years, we did fantastic finds. We found some very important tombs, of which we already have parts in the Leiden collection since the early 19th century. But very dear to me is a wonderful intact sculpture we found in 2001, a statue about 1 meter high, showing a high official and his wife. It's a double statue, and it was still in the original place in the cult chapel of their tomb. The man is called Neith, his wife Anui. The statue is brightly painted, it's inscribed, and it is in a very good quality and in a wonderful style. It was immediately taken to the Cairo Museum, where it's now one of the treasures in the galleries of the Egyptian Museum, and we are very proud of that. If I would have to give a message to our dear colleagues in Quebec, it would be that well, I know it's a lot of hard work, but please take pleasure in this wonderful subject. Egyptian magic is such a fascinating subject, and it can really enrich your life. I don't mean that you have to perform magic at home or in your spare time, but if you really immerse yourself in this ancient theory about the cosmic wisdom that is around us, it becomes so special, and you recognize so many things that are still alive in what we now call superstition. It's still all around us. It's still a fascination of Western culture as well. And after all, what are our scientists doing other than looking for the principles of the universe? It's much the same. Take pleasure.